you may or may not be very familiar with the work of the Royal School of Church Music. We are an educational charity whose mission is to develop, support and nurture church musicians and to encourage the church to make the best use of music in worship. The RSCM was founded back in 1927 by Sir Sidney Nicholson, and he could little have imagined the world of 2020, where for a time worship could only happen online and where the practical arrangements required to enable music making of any sort could be quite so challenging. But his passion for harnessing the power of music in worship and for encouraging all those that are responsible for it remains our passion today. We're glad to be able to respond proactively to the challenges the current circumstances present. The climate around us show our work and resources needed more than ever. We've had to adapt, change our offerings and show others how they must do that too, and we're working as best we can to build on our heritage, enabling new kinds of growth and development for the future. There is still much to celebrate, and the RSCM remains a stable presence alongside all those who do so much to sustain music and worship. In particular, we work to equip churches, their local communities, and their clergy, musicians and singers with practical resources and advice. Choral music remains vitally important to us, but we are not just for choirs. We want to help make churches use the best of their resources in a wide range of musical styles. The RSCM is an independent charity. We don't get money from the government or the church, but we work closely alongside the church and continue to do our utmost to help shape its future. We are thankful for all our members and supporters who enable us to keep doing this. You can join them, perhaps by becoming a member yourself, or donating, or by giving your support in a more practical way. Details of all these things are on our website, rscm.org.uk. We know that so many people value our work, but that news of what we can offer to others in support needs to be spread wider. Please help us by sharing in that task. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the first in our second series of lunchtime lectures from the RSCM. We are joined today by Dr Andrew Gant of St Peter's College, Oxford. Andrew is the author of 5 books and, among many other things, is former organist, choir master and composer at Her Majesty's Chapel Royal. So welcome to Andrew. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Stefan. It's very great to be with you. And before I kick off, I'm going to, with apologies, just start by issuing a small correction that not for the first time you've added a letter to my surname, which is actually Gant, not Grant. But please be assured you're not the first, and you won't be the last person to have done that. Usually by the BBC in the middle of a live broadcast.
Right, sorry about that.
Not at all.
Right, as many of you will already be familiar with how these sessions work, we'll go over it for those who don't. The lecture will last approximately 40 minutes. There is a chat feed at the side, and you can use that to tell us where you are joining from and to ask any questions. And if you are watching on Facebook, you can use the comment section and it will appear in the feed on this website. So we would love to hear from you. At the end of the lecture, I will also be giving out this week's code for any non-RSCM members who want to take advantage of our offer to become individual members for a year as a discount of 10%. And that code will be valid until 5 p.m. next Thursday. I'd also mention that Andrew's book, O Sing Unto the Lord, is available to buy now through RSCM Music Direct, and you should be able to see it now on the screen. Finally, before I hand over to Andrew, this lecture is of course free to watch, but I would remind viewers that the RSCM is a charity and that we do rely on the support of individuals such as yourselves to support church music and musicians. So please do consider making a donation in appreciation of this session. Right, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be engaging with an audience once again, even though, of course, it's not quite in the format that we were all used to for all those years. In a sense, this book is not really about music. As Elvis Costello once famously said, writing about music is a bit like dancing about architecture. So this book is really just as much about how the music of the English church fits into what was going on around it over the ages and what the music can tell us about people's lives if we take the trouble to look. So to begin with, here is an example. One of the most famous of all pieces of English church music, If Ye Love Me by Thomas Tallis. Short, pretty, direct, to the point, words in English, and you can hear them. When you start to ask yourself why it is like that, why church music sounds like it does, it starts to reveal whole layers of society, manners, politics, and even a little bit of religion. Tallis lived for most of the 16th century. That was quite an achievement in itself, but if you were a musician, even more so. Tallis worked for 4 different English monarchs, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Each had very different ideas about how church music fitted into the liturgy, and those ideas in each case were very different from their predecessor. So why does that piece sound like it does? Because Edward, who came to the throne at the age of 9, was a devout Protestant. He followed the dictates of the man who served both him and his father as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who famously wrote to Edward's father, Henry VIII, about putting English words to music. In my opinion, the song that should be made thereunto would not be full of notes, but as near as may be, for every syllable a note, so that it may be sung distinctly and devoutly. But it's not just a question of minims and crotchets. If you listen to the music of a contemporary like John Marbeck, for example, you can hear the progress of something rather less cerebral. Marbeck, like Tallis, wrote music for the pre-Reformation Catholic Church. But unlike Tallis, at the Reformation, he pinned his colours very firmly to the reformist mast, indeed rather too much so. In the late 1540s, Marbeck and 3 of his colleagues, including another member of the choir at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, were arrested and tried by their own dean and condemned to die. Their crime was owning writings by the continental reformer John Calvin. So the progress in Marbeck's music from the Latin Mass to a little English carol also shows the movement of social and political forces which were extremely dangerous. But there was another twist. Of the 4 who were condemned to die, 3 went to the flames. But Marbeck did not. He was reprieved on the direct orders of the king. Why? Was it because Henry simply admired his music? The business of how composers play the game of high-level politics is an important thread through this story. Marbeck lived to see his beloved Protestantism become the official state religion. One of Marbec's other compositions, and the one by which he is best known today, was a simple unison setting of texts from the New English Prayer Book. We still often sing it today. Now, if I was doing this talk to a live audience, this is where I would get you to join in. And I would say, I'm going to sing something to you and ask you to reply. The Lord be with you. And I dare say some of you have replied, but I can't hear you. Some of you will have sung, and with thy spirit. Others perhaps, and also with you. But what you're singing is Marbeck. But Marbeck didn't write that. He took that music from the setting of the same part of the liturgy to the old Latin rite. So what he was doing was making the music sound as much like what people were already familiar with as he possibly could. And we can see how that idea has moved through time and has adapted not just to the Prayer Book of 1549, but to later editions as well. So there is a thread that runs through this whole strand, this whole story of English church music. And we can see, just simply by looking at the music on the page in front of you, how well Marbeck achieved what he was setting out to do. It's a simple process, but it works. This idea of the people themselves singing to their God in a language which they understand, rather than listening to a trained initiate do it for them in a language which he understands but they don't, is fundamental, perhaps the most fundamental change in the music from the pre-Reformation Catholic Church to the post-Reformation Protestant Church. Another hugely interesting thread is the extent to which the authorities tried to tell people what to do, and the extent to which people actually did it, usually not very much. Psalm singing became enormously popular. The entrepreneurs of the new science of printing leapt at the huge opportunities of this new market. Poets and divines fell over each other to produce metrical, that is, rhyming English versions of the Psalms, and to print them with music. And there are a great many such books. Here is a page from one of them. This is the opening of Psalm 84 in a metrical version printed by Thomas Ravenscroft in 1621. So here are the words of Psalm 84 in the Book of Common Prayer, non-metrical version, sometimes called the prose version. Oh, how amiable are thy dwellings, thou Lord of hosts! My soul hath a desire and longing to enter into the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh rejoice in the living God. Yea, the sparrow hath found her an house, and the swallow a nest where she may lay her young. Even thy altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. And here is the text, which is printed in front of you in Ravenscroft's Psalter. How pleasant is thy dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, to me, the tabernacle of thy grace. How pleasant, Lord, they be. The sparrows find a room to rest and save themselves from wrong, and eke the swallow hath a nest wherein to keep her young. So you get the internal rhymes, but you also get the regular rhythm. Da 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 da. And that rhythm became so ubiquitous that it was known as common meter. And a great many psalms and other passages from the Bible were put into that meter. There is a green hill far away without a city wall, while shepherds watch their flocks by night, all seated on the ground. They all have the same rhythm, which means that the singer can adapt those words to any tune in the same rhythm, which they already know, whether they can read music or can afford a book or not. So here, for example, is the tune that Ravenscroft has put to Psalm 84. Now you can see how it's laid out in front of you. You've got the cantus part, then below it the tenor part, and on the right-hand page the medius part and the bassus part. So that's four-part harmony, but laid out in individual parts. And the tune, as always at the time, is in the tenor. And you can see it's marked there with a woodcut of a little hand pointing at the tune, as if the tenor's a bit too dim to work out where the tune is all by himself. Now just have a look at that tune. How pleasant is thy dwelling place, O Lord of hosts, to me, the tabernacle of thy grace. How pleasant, Lord, they be. So there it is, a set of words to a particular tune. And you think, well, they go like that because they always go like that. Often that is not the case. And the process by which a particular tune, a particular set of words, a particular translation have ended up coming together is often a rather complicated and tortuous story. And that's part of the interest of this wonderful and fascinating and rich history. The earliest printed English Psalter was Sternhold and Hopkins' Whole Book of Psalms. In its various editions, it's estimated to have sold many hundreds of thousands, possibly even as many as 1 million copies in a century and more after it was first published. And that little tune that we've just seen there used by Ravenscroft tells us something absolutely vital about what religion meant to the people and how they expressed it. The 17th century as a whole was not one of the happier times for English church music. The old debate between Catholics and Protestants turned into a new debate between different kinds of Protestant. High Church Anglicans, led by Archbishop William Laud, and Puritans. What started as a war of words soon turned into a real war. Church music, for the first and so far only time in English history, stopped altogether. And that could have been the end. Revolutions effectively ended the tradition of church music in other European countries, for example, in France. But not here. Despite the pressures that it was under, church music found a way back with the rather unexpected restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Its principal musical vehicle was the verse anthem with strings, and its principal genius was Henry Purcell. But just as with Tallis, it's one of the features of these great geniuses of the English church that they could turn their hand to whatever politics and society threw at them. The Restoration Party was great fun, but it could never last. It was too expensive, and the flamboyance and the opulence smacked of debauchery and, even worse, of Catholicism. When James II was eventually booted out in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution, the era of the symphony anthem was over. So here is a piece of music by Henry Purcell responding to the new church music environment. Thou knowest, Lord, the secrets of our hearts, one of the funeral sentences from the Book of Common Prayer. Purcell wrote a complete set for the funeral of his admired boss, Queen Mary II, in 1695. And just a few months later, they were sung at his own funeral in the same church, Westminster Abbey, where he was organist. Things went a bit dull after that. The 18th century really belongs to two traditions which can be summed up in two great names, Handel and Wesley. George Frederick Handel didn't write a huge amount of church music, certainly compared to his efforts in the fields of oratorio and opera. But there's no doubt whatever that what he did write was by far and away the best of its age and hugely influential on every composer of art music, really through to the arrival of another German visitor 100 years later, Felix Mendelssohn. The name Wesley introduces us to another species of music. There are several absolutely fascinating strands to this story. And what I've tried to do in the book is to tell the story not just of the music of the great geniuses, but of the music of the ordinary man and woman in the pew as well. Even more so than music for the top professionals and for trained choirs, their music tells us what life was like. Between the Reformation in the 1540s and the mid-18th century, their music was basically psalm singing. The beautiful, plain, elegant, hand-printed psalters, often with a woodcut of King David playing the harp, evoke in a very moving way the image of a household, perhaps a father with a group of children under the watchful eye of his wife and maybe a couple of servants, singing psalms together around the household hearth. Musically, this is what Protestantism is all about. In the 18th century, for various complicated legal and other reasons, psalm singing was eventually largely superseded by another kind of corporate music making with roots in the nonconformist tradition, and perhaps the most important and all-embracing development in all of English church music, hymns. And perhaps the most important figure in the early development of this movement was Charles Wesley. Wesley wrote perhaps 6,000 hymns, maybe as many as 9,000 if you count all of the many devotional poems that he wrote as well. Many of them are still sung today, of course, not necessarily as he intended. And this is partly because he didn't often say exactly how he intended his hymns to be sung. Very often his own publications didn't mention a tune, allowing singers to use any tune they already knew with words in a similar metrical pattern, allowing tunes to be brought in from all sorts of different traditions. How about this one, for example? Hark how all the welkin rings, Alleluia. Glory to the King of Kings, Alleluia. Now that might, just might, be how Charles Wesley himself sang the poem, which we, many years later, have bowdlerized into Hark the Herald Angels Sing and bolted onto a chorus by Mendelssohn, which he originally wrote as a cantata to mark the anniversary of the death of Johannes Gutenberg, the early printer. So when you eventually can go back into a church and sing Hark the Herald Angels Sing, don't think that those words and that tune have always been put together like that, because they haven't. And the process by which they arrived in the form in which we use them today is often complicated and involves many, many different hands in both the words and the music. There are lots of different kinds of 18th century hymn. Just a couple will perhaps illustrate how varied the tradition had become. Something which, in a sense, we lost after the Victorians turned all hymn singing into a kind of stodgy four-part affair with big organ accompaniment, making them all largely sound the same, which they very much were not in the traditions to which they originally belong. The Gracious Firmament on High. This was originally written as a little two-part piece for treble voices with a separate bass accompaniment. It was, in fact, more like a congregational arts song, almost a mini cantata, than what we think of as a hymn. And there's a reason for that. One of the great themes of 18th century Enlightenment was philanthropy. And this expressed itself in a range of educational and social initiatives, including what were known as hospitals for various needy types. For example, in London, there was Locke's Hospital for sufferers from venereal disease, Coram's Hospital for orphans, and the Magdalen Hospital for penitent prostitutes. There is the interior of the chapel of the Foundling Hospital, and up in the gallery there, those are the children sort of stacked up on either side of the organ, and this was a sight that was often described by visitors to London, seeing these many hundreds of charity children singing in the chapels. These were Christian foundations. Large numbers of residents, often children and women, who spent their days receiving instructions into godly living, which naturally included a great deal of going to church and a great deal of singing. And because they had the time, money through public subscription, and the incentive, a lot of these places achieved very high musical standards. And a number of notable musicians took part in the music making, including famously Handel at the Coram's Hospital. So a hymn like The Spacious Firmament on High, whose words were written by Thomas Addison and published originally not in a hymn book, but in the Spectator magazine, tells us, as church music so often does, something important about English life if we choose to look. When I survey the wondrous cross, a nice sturdy striding English tune called Rockingham. Tunes like that were collected and printed rather than actually composed by a wonderfully eccentric group of characters in this book, a sort of posse of rude mechanicals, the itinerant country musicians. These men would stride around the country, selling their skills in country towns, sharing what usually rather patchy knowledge of music theory they had with the local children, and running the church choir. Their books are wonderfully evocative, bursting with what Cecil Sharp later rather patronizingly called the natural, untutored art of the peasant. The words are full of fire and brimstone, and the music is full of character and wrong notes. And this tradition then led into perhaps one of the most English and eccentric parts of the story, the West Gallery tradition. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, men of the parish would gather in the gallery at the back, which became their private space, jealously guarded. They would be joined by anyone who could sing and by a ragtag bunch of instruments, as in this famous picture where you can see a cello, a violin, a man at the back playing what appears to be a flageolet or an oboe, children reading from a shared book. The band would include bassoon, cello, perhaps a fiddle or two, something more exotic like a serpent or a vamp horn. And it's only relatively recently that scholars and performers have begun to unearth this wonderfully characterful repertoire. Another sub-theme that runs throughout this book is the ongoing debate, sometimes rather more than debate, between clergy and musicians. Sometimes their objectives have not, to put it mildly, always been entirely in harmony. West Gallery music certainly produced a good deal of opposition from the kind of clergymen we meet in the pages of Jane Austen, who liked their churchmanship refined, well-behaved, and undemanding. The second half of the 19th century saw the resumption of another fundamental debate between the High Church Catholic wing and the less flamboyant Protestant trend. The principal expression of the Anglo-Catholic tendency was the Oxford movement, and it expressed itself in an ambition to harness the beauty of holiness in everything, from its architecture to its words, to its theatrical liturgy, to its organ building, and of course, its music. And that music eventually led to pieces like this. And there's a prize for anybody who spotted me in that video. So what does that piece tell us? Charles Wood, the composer, was an Irishman and a Protestant and an academic. He followed his compatriot Charles Villiers Stanford as professor of music at Cambridge University. And that grand, expansive, all-embracing theatrical style grew out of the huge explosion of choirs and choral singing through the later Victorian period, as well, of course, as advances in organ building technology. But the words have an entirely different provenance. And again, if we just scratch the surface, we find something rather interesting going on. Right back in the 1620s, King James I took a trip back to Scotland to patronize his former countrymen. And when he got back, his court composer Orlando Gibbons, like a well-behaved employee, provided an anthem welcoming him home. And as so often with this kind of piece, the words don't really overcome the tendency of a slightly dull and sycophantic commission to say anything particularly meaningful. Oh, all true faithful hearts with one accord, etc., etc. But the music is absolutely delightful. So 250 years later, when the high-minded scholars and clergy of the Oxford movement were beginning to uncover the music of Gibbons and others, they wanted to bring fine pieces like that back into use. But, of course, there wouldn't have been much point in standing up in church and singing an anthem saying, "Welcome home, James I." So, a musically minded clergyman by the name of H.R. Bramley, who, by the way, in another project collaborated with John Stainer on an important book of Christmas carols, wrote new words to go with Gibbons' music. And lo and behold, a brand new Gibbons verse anthem is born. O thou, the central orb of righteous love. And those are the words which Charles Wood set to music in the anthem that we've just heard. So again, if we scratch the surface of what looks like a perfectly blameless piece of English church music, we find something interesting going on, which tells us a bit about the history of this tradition. It also explains why the words don't really appear to mean anything very much, because they were written to fit to an existing musical scheme rather than to actually say anything. What exactly is a central orb? I've sung that piece so many times and I'm still not entirely sure. I've mentioned that there are a number of themes which fascinatingly run through the entire history of English church music from the beginning. One is the question of who sings. Another is the question of who is in charge, the clergy or the musicians. Third, which dates back to the very earliest records of church music, long before any actual music itself which survives, is the question of whether fancy music gets in the way of the words and of devotion. And there have always been those who believe that it does, and who often express themselves in the most colourful language. Multitudes of singing men bleating in their chapels, basses neighing like horses, tenors swooning like dying women. These are the words of religious writers from the 12th to the 17th centuries, and there's plenty more of that kind of stuff. Another strand, of course, has been Catholicism versus Protestantism. And that divide was very much still there into the era of Sir Edward Elgar, seen here playing a trombone for some reason. Elgar was a Catholic, but unlike in the days of Byrd and Tallis, it was not likely to cost him his life. Elgar wrote a relatively small amount of church music, but some of it is very beautiful. Ave Verum by Elgar, sung there in Hereford Cathedral, conducted by Roy Massey. And the image of a man walking a dog along the river seems very appropriate for this composer. It's a charming little melody which could very easily have done service as a little salon piece for violin and piano, like Salut d'amour or Chanson de matin. And it tells us something about what was going on in England if we choose to look. What other English composer set those words? Possibly nobody since William Byrd. Where was it sung? Not in Elgar's beloved Worcester Cathedral, that's for sure, not in Latin, perhaps in the local Catholic church where Elgar's father took on the job of organist, not through devotion, but for the money. Elgar Sr. was scathing about all forms of organized religion. The role of simply making a living and getting paid cannot be underestimated as a factor in the development of artistic trends. Herbert Howells only started writing church music at all as the result of a bet. And so we head into the 20th century and towards the end of our very brief resume of this wonderful, rich story. And all the strands are still there. Who sings, who's in charge, hymns or choir pieces, Latin or English. Only, of course, now there are some new variants on the old questions. Organs or guitars, hymn books or projector screens. For choirs with the traditional setup of robed adults and children, girl choristers as well as boys. Should we sing not just in Latin, but in French, German, Russian, or anything else? For churches on the evangelical side, does the worship group with its drum kits and microphones actually recreate exactly what it was trying to avoid, namely a performance given by an exclusive group of musicians rather than an inclusive act of musical worship involving everybody? These are the most ancient questions of all, asked simply with a modern accent. And regrettably, they can still cause division. We can all think of occasions when a new vicar or a new choir director arrived and tried to change things, and the results are not always pretty. But a lot of the music is.
The choir will now sing The Lord Bless You by the British composer John Rutter.
The Lord Bless You and Keep You by, who else? John Rutter. Another factor that has opened up in the 20th and 21st centuries is the sheer variety of music and musical style church music has been able to embrace. We have everything from hard-edged modernism of Peter Maxwell Davies to congregational folk masses by Patrick Appleford and Martin Shaw, the wonderful modal choral music of Herbert Howells and the tradition that he was part of, songs by songwriters like Graham Kendrick, Taizé-style chants, gospel music, and music by the composer that we've just heard, John Rutter. John realized very early in his career that the simple, timeless virtues of the song, a nice tune, simple harmony, well-balanced phrases, verse and chorus structure, words which are simple yet direct, could be transplanted into the choir stall, and the results have been extremely influential and popular. So where does all this leave us? Well, the great debates that have driven church music are still with us and always will be. But perhaps the abiding message of this wonderful, rich, complex, muddled story is that English church music has always found a way of embracing and incorporating all of these objectives and traditions and turning them to good account. Not all of our neighboring countries have managed to do that. Why is that? Part of the reason is that as a nation, we have by and large, so far, tended to do things by evolution rather than revolution, which is perhaps why some of our great British traditions have turned out to be so odd. Look at Parliament, the monarchy, cricket. Another is that we are, at our best, a tolerant, liberal, inclusive nation. As Anthony Trollope is said to have remarked, the Church of England is the only church which interferes neither with your politics nor your religion. We tend not to demand doctrinal certainty, which means we have been able to include a lot of thoughtful, creative musicians and other creators who were not themselves orthodox believers. Another reason, and one which certainly means a huge amount to me personally, is the words that we have to work with. We are immensely blessed, surely more than any other tradition in the world, to have the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. What composer would not be moved and inspired by that wonderful legacy? And especially when you look at what composers as diverse as Gibbons, Purcell, Handel, Howells, and Rutter have done with it. Add to that the devotional writings of Thomas Cranmer, George Herbert, John Donne, Isaac Watts, Charles Wesley, John Mason Neale, Robert Bridges, to name just a few, and you have a music already present in the language. A fourth reason is architecture. Our forebears gave us so many wonderful buildings and built music into the fabric. Pre-Reformation churches will have the choir stalls facing each other across the chancel. And that, of course, appears in so much of our wonderful music. Dorset churches have their west galleries at the back where the choir would go. Private household chapels of the Elizabethan and Victorian periods alike will have music built into their architecture. Music is there in the stones and the stalls and in the sound of the choir boys' hobnailed boots rattling up the wooden stairs to the gallery like a regiment of cavalry, I should say, as Thomas Hardy put it. Surely people will always make music in these buildings because the music is already there. So that is perhaps the main point of what we begin to find when we scratch away at those funny little black marks on the 5, sometimes 4 lines of the musical stave on the page. They don't just give us some of the best music in the world, although they assuredly do that. They provide us with a history of a country and its people, its buildings, its politics, and its conversations with itself, of its wars and tragedies, both public and personal. It's a history of grand, rich, well-educated people who could tell us what they were thinking in some of the finest language ever written, and of peasants and paupers who could not. It's a history of music and a history of a tradition, but it's more than that. It's a history of us.
Andrew, good. Thank you ever so much. I'm not the only person who found that absolutely fascinating. I can see from the comment stream down the side that it was thoroughly appreciated all round. And I think we all enjoyed those beautiful musical examples. So thank you once again. In a moment, we're going to go to the questions and answers. But before we do, here is a word from the director of the RSCM, Hugh Morris.
Thanks, Steph, for passing me over, and thank you to Andrew for your excellent lecture today. So greetings to you all. As Steph said, I am the director of the RSCM. Thanks for joining us today, and I do hope you've been enjoying the lecture, and do get those questions in so that you can put them to Andrew to answer. So the RSCM is really pleased to make these lectures free, but we would encourage you to show your appreciation by supporting our work with a financial donation. You can do that online or by using the text codes that will appear on the screen. The discount offer to become an individual member, which Steph talked about at the beginning, is also easiest to access via the same gold donate button on the RSCM's website. By becoming a member, it lets us connect more easily with you and enables us to journey together into the future. Your support really does make a difference to us. We've got lots of really exciting plans for the future, which we're preparing now and we'll be sharing shortly over the next few weeks. But we need to make sure that we've got the resources to deliver them as quickly as we know we need to secure the future in the life of the music, the music in the life, I should say, of all our parishes and churches, picking up that story that Andrew's been talking about. We are a charity, and people are often surprised that we don't receive any money from the central church or from the state. Finally, today's lecture is based on Andrew's excellent book, and I have my copy here, and actually the lecture today has reminded me that it must be about time I read it again. I've also recently been reading this book by one of our vice presidents, Brian Kay. He's had a distinguished career as a singer, a broadcaster, and a conductor. We're hosting an evening in conversation with Brian on Thursday, the 28th of January, and you can buy a ticket to join us for that. Brian has a rich story of anecdotes to tell. Just scroll on down on the home page of the RSCM website and you can find how to buy a ticket to join us. It's sure to be a good way of spending a winter's evening, particularly when there aren't all that many other ways that you might be looking to do that at the moment, so I warmly encourage you to join us for that. Thanks again for whatever you're able to donate to us. We really do appreciate it. And as they say on the news at this point, back to the studio, Steph.
Thank you very much, Hugh. So just to reiterate what Hugh said very briefly, please, if you can, do show you going online to make a donation. Finally, before we move on to the questions, next week's lecture will be given by Chloe Allison, who will be talking about how late 12th century Parisian musicians began creating previously unimagined forms of complex polyphony in plain chant. So, Andrew, questions. John Woodhouse asks, do we know how metrical psalms were sung in parish churches? Was it unison or in 4 parts?
Interesting question. The short answer, I think, is not really, because so much of this story at parish level is lacking in much in the way of documentary evidence. My sort of impression, and I don't want to sort of put it much further than this, is that psalters and psalms were used as much, if not more, in the home than actually in church, certainly in the early period, in the 16th century. By the time you get to, for example, if you read the diaries of Samuel Pepys in the Restoration period, there's lots of talk there about him singing psalms in his local parish church in London, which presumably was reasonably well resourced by national standards. And Pepys, as always, is very funny about this, about how the congregation will start singing the wrong tune and all this kind of thing. But my feeling is that music in an ordinary parish church during the 16th century, for a start, would depend very much on where it was and whether it had much in the way of resources in terms of people and staff books and things like that. But was probably limited more to perhaps a little bit of Marbeck, perhaps with a little bit of sort of improvised harmony in the sort of pre-Reformation style, and that the psalms themselves were probably sung more in the home than they were in church. But as I say, the actual sort of documentary evidence for that statement is pretty limited.
Thank you very much. I've got one eye on the clock, but I still have a little bit of time. So if I can, I'm going to monopolize you and ask a question myself. I was very interested in what you had to say about the diversity of hymn writing and singing in the late 17th and 18th centuries, the early 18th century, before things were made, I think you used the word somewhat stodgy by perhaps the Victorians. One prominent figure who you mentioned was, of course, Joseph Addison, who I seem to remember trained for the clergy originally and was obviously very concerned with questions of social morality. Yeah, but I think by the late 18th century, 17th century, I think I'm right in saying that other influences were creeping into hymn writing, and this perhaps must have raised significant questions about the kind of text that were permissible. Pindaric influences, I'm thinking of, creeping in, and whether that might have taken hymnody down the wrong path. I remember Jeremy Collier and I think John Dennis expressing concerns along those lines, and of course Joseph Addison was very concerned with the social effects of music, Italian opera, for example. So my question is, do you think that such concerns were really justified? I mean, do you actually find many examples of such hymn writing appearing?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question, and it sort of encompasses lots of different strands there. One that you referred to is the idea that music has a sort of moral effect by itself, and often people worried that the moral effect of music was bad, was dangerous. Italian opera, the word that you read constantly right the way through this history is lascivious. Music that appeals to the senses is somehow encouraging loose living of all kinds. This is an idea that never really goes away, and you can hear it, Puritans complaining about choir boys singing melismas, using very similar language to people complaining about women singing on the stage, never mind in church. You use the word permissible there, and I think that's another interesting strand, is the extent to which this was actually governed by law. Of course, because the Anglican Church is the established church, what you can actually sing in church is a matter of law. And through the 18th century, essentially the only things that were allowed in service were things that were in the Bible or the Book of Common Prayer. So the idea that you could sing like a devotional poem, still less that you could sing a Christmas carol, which is frankly a folk tradition, I Saw Three Ships or The Holly and the Ivy or something like that, would have been deeply shocking, really, to a sort of obedient Anglican throughout the 18th century. And in fact, that's why the only what we think of as Christmas carol that was allowed to be sung in church throughout the whole of that century pretty much was While Shepherds Watched, because it is a metrical paraphrase of verses from St. Luke, and was included in the new Psalter of Tate and Brady at the very end of the 17th century. So these pressures are always there, and I think it's also worth remembering that the real impetus for hymn singing, for massed congregational singing, didn't come from the Anglican Church. It came from the nonconformist tradition, particularly Methodists, but also all sorts of other brands, Presbyterians and Congregationalists and all that kind of thing. And it was really only in the second half of the 19th century, after the publication of Hymns Ancient and Modern, that Anglicanism started to try and catch up. But those pressures have always been there, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. So it just remains for me to say a thank you once again to Andrew, and to remind people that next week's lecture will focus on plain chant in late 12th century France, and that if you do wish to donate or are able to become a member of the RSCM, the information will be on screen for a few minutes after we leave. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
you.